My name is Michael Gerrard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School in New York City and director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. I'm also the chairman of the faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. I teach courses on environmental law, energy law, and climate change law, and the center that I run tries to develop legal techniques to fight climate change, to develop information resources for use by lawyers and judges and academics around the world, and to train people in the use of these various legal techniques.
Right, and what is the purpose you are here at the conference in Paris?
For several years, I've been working closely with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which, as you know, is located about halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And they're one of the countries that is most endangered by climate change. Their national existence is threatened by rising waters that could drown the entire country. So I've been acting as a legal advisor to the Marshall Islands for several years, and I'll be doing that here as well.
Yes, because of course your expertise is in the legal field, and what we are wondering is how do you see the role of law to help in the fight against climate change? What is your vision on it?
So all the agreements that are developed with respect to climate change are embodied in legal documents. Some of them are more, some of them are less legally binding. Then the implementation of them is almost exclusively at the domestic level. Each state has its own system of laws to carry out its pledges and policies with respect to climate change. So we, of course, focus at the Sabin Center mostly on the United States law, but we also look a great deal at international law.
Because what the second question is whether you see a global trend happening, like the global trend in the use of law to fight against climate change. Do you see that law is more and more used in order to achieve results of climate change, or do you think this is something that has been there already in the past?
I think it varies quite a bit from one country to another. There is certainly growing consciousness around the world about the importance of dealing with climate change, and quite a few countries have adopted laws on the subject. A problem is that it's all subject to domestic politics, and so as the politics of one country become more or less favorable to regulation, those rules can change. In Canada, for instance, for several years the national government did not want to do much about climate change, but they've recently elected a new Prime Minister, Trudeau, who does want to act, and so he's moving very aggressively on that front. Australia recently had a change in the Prime Minister, and so you have a lot of variation from country to country, and also sometimes from year to year.
Because what we see, an example of that is the Oslo Principles, is also that by the use of law, lawyers and experts try to bring a framework for politics basically to be used, right? So my question is, yesterday you were present at the Oslo Principles. What was the reason those principles were created, and is this also a part of the trends that you see that law is used more often?
So the Oslo Principles were formed by a group of lawyers and judges and professors around the world. I was one of them, and we met several times to try to find the overarching legal principles that can and should apply to climate change. And these principles talk about the obligations of different countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Our hope is that judges in different countries around the world will adopt these principles and apply them in their own decisions. So it is part of an effort to expand the use of law and these legal principles in the fight against climate change.
So should we expect a wave of lawsuits all over the world in the next 10, 20 years?
There actually have been quite a few lawsuits brought around the world in the last 2 or 3 years trying to establish the importance of each country where the suit is filed to fight climate change, and I think we will see more and more of that. Of course, one reason for the lawsuits is that the international agreements have not yet gone far enough or have not yet achieved enough implementation. And so the lawsuits in part try to push the process along. Were there to be an agreement that were as encompassing enough. And if the countries were to really carry out their obligations, then there wouldn't be a need for these lawsuits.
So could you then say that examples such as the Oslo Principles basically interfere in politics because politics isn't quick enough in order to do something about climate change?
I don't think I would say interfere. I think they try to overcome some of the constraints that politics have imposed on the pace at which different countries carry out these actions.
In July, there has been a case in the Netherlands, the Urgenda case, in which an NGO had sued the state, and the state lost, which meant that it had to decrease, or is obliged by law to decrease, the greenhouse gas emissions with 25% in 2020. You said there were already more examples around the world in which those kind of law enforcement are happening on climate change. Do you indeed expect that this is going to be an example for the rest of the world? Was this a breakthrough?
The Urgenda decision was the first time that any court anywhere in the world had ordered a government to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions beyond what the the government had already agreed to do or had already established. As you said, the Dutch state had agreed to certain emissions reductions. The court said that wasn't enough and had to go further. So that was the first time any such decision had been issued anywhere in the world. There was a decision in September issued by a trial court in Pakistan saying that the government was not carrying out its own policy to prepare for climate change in terms of adaptation. Then in November, a decision in Washington State in the United States declared that there is a constitutional right under the Constitution of the state of Washington for a healthful environment, including controlling climate change. But in that case, the court found that the state government was already doing what it needed to do, and so it refused to issue any orders. A lawsuit similar to Urgenda has been brought in Belgium, is now in its early stages. A lawsuit has been brought in a court in Germany against a large German energy company, RWE, by a farmer in Peru, saying that the greenhouse gases that were caused in part by this German company are causing the melting of the glaciers and seeking money damages. So we're seeing more and more of these lawsuits being brought around the world.
Do you consider that as a good development? Is that indeed how climate change should be solved?
Well, I think ideally climate change would be solved by the national governments themselves acting on their own. But many governments have not done that, or at least hardly any have done as much as they can. So I think it is very useful to have these lawsuits further pushing them along. It's clearly not the only solution. It is not even the best solution, but we don't have the best solution. So given what we have, I think this needs to be part of the picture.
One of the critics yesterday in the Oslo Principle meeting was the relation with the ethical involvement of judges on environmental issues. And it was argued that in a pluralistic environment like France, for example, where we are right now, how can judges deal with environmental ethics in practice?
So some ethical principles vary from one place to another, but there are also universally accepted principles of ethics. One of them is the right to life and the idea that people should be able to live healthy lives in an environment that is not killing them. I don't think there will be any dissent from that. So regardless of where in the world and what religion you're in, people have that view. And so I think it is entirely appropriate for judges to be applying those universal ethical precepts.
You are personally working in the United States, and you're also from the United States. How do you see the role of the United States in the climate debate and in the conference of today?
So as you know, the United States is the subject of a tremendous amount of political polarization at this time. The leaders of the Democratic Party are almost uniformly in favor of acting on climate change, and that includes President Obama. The leaders of the Republican Party these days are unfortunately almost uniformly opposed to acting on climate change, and many of them doubt the underlying science of climate change. The Republican Party and this leadership now dominate both the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives, making it very difficult for President Obama to do what he would like to do. So President Obama has had to use the existing environmental statutes in the United States. Congress has not passed a new environmental law since 1990. We have 25 years of this paralysis. So the president is doing what he can within the existing old statutory structure. It is not nearly as much as he would like to do, as many of us would like to do. But one effect that all of this has on the conference, the climate conference in Paris, is that any agreement that committed the United States to further emissions reductions, that was truly binding, would require a treaty which under the U.S. Constitution must be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. There's no way that the current Senate would ratify a climate treaty. That means that the U.S. cannot agree to a treaty that has binding emissions limitations. It could agree to a treaty that reaffirms some things it's already agreed to, like monitoring and verification, but not binding emissions modifications. And that inhibits the entire international conference. So it means we can't have a globally binding international treaty.
Yes, that's what actually surprised me a couple of weeks ago, because the expectation was to create a legally binding agreement, or at least that was the goal.
Right.
And now we have seen that, for example, China has even agreed to have a legally binding agreement, and President or Mr. Kerry indeed announced that that was not possible. And your explanation for that is that the Senate wouldn't agree upon it?
That's right. That's right. In order for the U.S. to be legally bound to a new international obligation would require the ratification of the Senate, which with current politics is not possible.
So would there be any solution in order to change that? Because if we look at this procedure, you wouldn't expect that the U.S. in the next 40 years will reach at all a legally binding agreement with the rest of the world, if that's the case.
Well, I don't know about 40 years. Who knows what politics will be 40 years from now? But certainly not in the next 5 or 6 years. We won't have that kind of a change. One could imagine an agreement that where the other countries of the world are legally bound, and the U.S. says we're not legally bound, but we will do our best. There are other ways in which the UN climate conferences treat different countries differently. So this is not the ideal method by far, but one could imagine that. And as I said, the U.S. can agree to binding commitments on monitoring and verification, reporting, and so forth, because that's already part of U.S. law.
Back to the conference in Paris for those weeks. In the past 20 years, the climate negotiations have not brought a lot of solutions to climate change.
I would say 25 years, just about 25 years.
Yeah, 25 years.
Right.
Do you have hope for this conference that there's going to be more achieved than has been achieved in the past 25 years?
Well, I think progress will certainly be made, and of course, by the time anyone sees this interview, the conference will already be over and we'll know what will have happened. But the expectations, at least going into the conference, is that there will be a series of non-binding voluntary commitments, each country coming up with its own, and that those commitments do not add up to nearly enough to keep within the 2-degree centigrade objective that we have, and therefore we'll come back in another 5 years and try to do better next time. So
you certainly don't believe that this conference will be enough to stay under this 2 degrees Celsius? What
certainly based on what came out before the conference began.
Yeah, of course. What would you be hoping for? What would be your ideal outcome of the conference?
The ideal outcome of the conference would be that that countries increase their level of ambition to the point that they do achieve this, and also that the countries that have made a pledge to come up with at least $100 billion a year every year beginning in 2020 to help the least developed countries with both mitigation and adaptation, that they actually come up with this money, and that other mechanisms be established to make sure all of this happens.
You say countries should do more, should be more committed to climate change. To which countries are you particularly pointing to? Which countries in the past 5 years, as well as in this conference, have been the real struggle in order to change something?
Well, certainly the United States doesn't have a comprehensive climate law. There are many things that are being done. Our emissions over the last several years are down a little bit, but not nearly enough. They have to decline much more radically than they have. Russia has been very difficult. Russia has not agreed to many of the other commitments. A major open issue is India. Of course, the population of India will surpass the population of China around 2022. And India does not have the same kind of powerful central government that China does. When China's central government decides that it really wants to do something, it has the ability to carry it out. That is not the case in India. India also has far lower per capita emissions than the United States or even China or most other countries. And they understandably have said that they should have the right to develop, including burning carbon, because all these other countries have done that. I think what we need is for it's important that India be able to develop, but to do it as cleanly as possible, and I think that will require a considerable amount of foreign assistance.
Do you think it's a valid argument of those countries like Brazil, India, China, that their industrial time has started later, so thus they should do less about climate change right now?
So China's emissions have soared radically, and the growth of emissions from China over the last decade has dominated the world picture. A lot of those emissions are to produce goods that are consumed in Europe and the United States and Japan. So a lot of it is for export. And so much of the pollution caused by the consumption of the developed countries has just been exported to China. I think it is certainly valid for a country to want to, one of the poorest countries to want to greatly increase its per capita emissions, and China has grown dramatically, and incomes on average have grown dramatically. India has far further to go. And so I do agree that it is valid for India to want to develop significantly past its current state. What would be a terrible consequence, though, would be if they developed a large and extremely expensive infrastructure built around coal, and in order to pay back the construction costs, that those coal facilities kept on operating for many decades to come.
The very last topic that I would like to discuss with you briefly is we see indeed that the legal sector of the world is trying to do a lot about climate change. We also see at this conference a lot of businesses present who really show their commitments and try to do something about this climate change. On the other hand, there is a lot of critique on those businesses, as people say they are doing on greenwashing. What is your perspective on the role of businesses in climate change? What is their role, and indeed are they the cause of climate change, or are they actually the solution?
I think that there is no possible solution that does not include active participation by business. The actions of business are, major greenhouse gas emitters of the world, but a lot of that is pursuant to national policies. It is the national policy of the United States to build a lot of roads and have a lot of people driving in cars and living in big houses and so forth. These energy companies meet the demand that is a matter of national policy. On the other hand, some of these companies have put out a lot of false information denying the existence of climate change, and have spent a great deal of money lobbying and campaigning against climate regulation. That, I think, is a very negative thing. I think that corporations are very important to developing the new technologies that we need. I think ultimately a lot of new technological developments, especially with clean energy, are a very important part of the solution, and those technological innovations are most likely to come from private business, often with government assistance. So we need to enlist the active support of business in moving us where we need to be.
Last question. What year will we go over the 2 degrees Celsius? How long? What is your expectation for the future in the next 50 years? Is it indeed? Are you really worried about what's going to happen, or are you slightly positive on the active participation that we see those days from all sectors of society?
So I'm really worried. I'm really worried that we are nowhere close to a 2-degree pathway. Of course, 2 degrees itself is very bad. The small island nations, including the Marshall Islands, who I work with very closely, would be underwater at 2 degrees, and they're calling for 1.5 degrees. But even 2 degrees seems very difficult to achieve. I can't predict what year will pass 2 degrees. I think the more important number is at what year does it become impossible to stay within 2 degrees, because there's a momentum built into the climate system. And so there are some estimates that by the 2040s or the 2050s, we will have passed the point where it is no longer possible to stay within 2 degrees, even if the 2-degree limit itself is not reached till the end of the century.
Thank you very much for the interview and participating in Room for Discussion.
Thank you.
We wish you good.